Okay, now that we have a fundamental understanding of what all these different channel names mean, we're going to start creating some materials. But we're not going to jump right into a complex object and start creating complex materials. Before we do that, we need to start with simple materials on a simple object. And to that end, we have this little funny little shape. It's got two materials on it. It has this ball shape and it has this base here. They each have their own material names. You can see those in the surface editor. There's the base, the material, and then of course there's one for the ground plane as well. The reason why we want to start with simple materials on simple shapes is that we are trying to develop a deep fundamental understanding of CG parameters and how they're used to create materials that look realistic. We have to understand that our renderer and our materials, all our software tools, are very pale approximations, pale shadows of reality. And there's a lot that we have to do and know and understand in order to get our tools to create the materials that we want to. And if we don't go at that step by step, carefully examine all of the parameters as we've done, and then carefully start applying them in very simplified ways before moving on to complex methods, we'll probably get to the end of this tutorial and you'll say, wow, this is a very interesting tutorial, but now I just want to make aluminum wing on an airplane and I don't know how to. And my hope is that by going step by step from simplicity to complexity, that we'll be able to follow a line of reasoning and a line of thinking that'll get you to the end of this tutorial and enable you to look at a material, analyze it, and understand how to make it in CG, or at least have a pretty decent idea where to start. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at some simple materials like chrome, glass, plastic. We're going to take a short look at skin and subsurface scattering because that's a large and complex topic. We're going to look at cloth and wood and stone. And after we look at all of those materials on this simple object, then we're going to move on to an actual model and we're going to texture that up to finished. And it's going to be a complex process, you'll see. So to begin with, let's just try to make chrome. Well, to begin with, we can light this a lot better. It's very difficult to tell whether or not your materials look any good if the lighting is no good. And this is the default lighting in Lightwave. It's just a distant light at 45 degrees or whatever, and pitch black in the shadows. Well, probably not. It's probably 5%. Let's look at the light properties. Yes, as usual, the ambient intensity defaults at 5%. That's completely evil because that clamps your lower value at 5. That should probably be like 0.5%. And we definitely need some kind of fill lighting in here. My favorite way to do it and the easiest way to do it, and the VPR here makes this super easy, is simply to add a backdrop. So go to Windows, Backdrop Options, and just enable the gradient backdrop. And this is just a fake backdrop color. Here we'll switch to perspective so we can look around at it if you're not familiar with it. So it's just a sort of a basic sky color with a dark zenith and a lighter horizon, and then below that is a kind of a dirt color. And those colors are defined right here. You can change them if you wish. We don't need to because we're not lighting the scene. All we want is some okay enough light that we can make our materials and sort of have a good idea that they're coming along well. Well, that's not the only thing. That just changes the color of the backdrop. We need to enable radiosity, and when we enable radiosity, this sphere of backdrop color will start emitting light into the scene as if it was an enormous skylight. Another way to do this is you could put a dome light in and color it, but this is super easy. Just turn on the default backdrop, go to the render globals, click on enable radiosity, and all of a sudden you have a model that's looking like it's actually three-dimensional and could even exist in real space. This alone should be a fairly strong indicator that you can spend 5 months texturing a model, but if you don't know how to light it, it's still going to look fake in CG. So I strongly urge you, if you want to be a texture artist and create great textures, to spend a lot of time also studying lighting. Lighting and materials are two sides of the same coin. One cannot exist and be successful without the other. So without further ado, let's move on to our first material, chrome. Alright, so the first simple material we're going to make is going to be chrome. So we want this to be kind of a chrome ball, and we'll see interreflections happening inside here. So this should be quite an interesting shape for us to work with. Now we could open up our surface editor and say to ourselves, well, I know what chrome looks like, and start fooling around with the values and make chrome. And if you are an expert artist and you know exactly what the properties of chrome are and exactly what it looks like, you might be able to do that. On the other hand, if that's the case, you're probably not watching this video. Here's what I recommend. If you decide you want to make a material like chrome, find some photographic reference. We all have access to the amazing oracle of information, the internet, and we can do a simple search. We'll just do a Google image search for chrome ball. See what we can come out with. So there we get immediately some chrome balls. There's actually some interesting ones here. Right away we get the idea of the typical ball bearing, very polished. Here's one that's a little bit more diffused. It's not quite as polished. This one's not quite as polished. This one's extremely polished, and you can see that it has there's a sky above it. This one is obviously taken in a studio. You can actually see the studio lighting in it, and it's on a plain table. So this one is actually more interesting. If you look, these two chrome balls look absolutely different, and look at this one too, quite different. The reason isn't because the chrome balls themselves are different, they're the same. The reason is because the environment changed. And this is a very important principle. If we're going to make materials that are reflective, we have to understand that it is crucial for there to be something to reflect. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'll just minimize this. I could take my material here, it's just called material, and I could turn up my reflection. This is what most people do. They just turn up their reflection and they say it's 100% reflective. That looks just like chrome. That's what chrome does. Well, this doesn't look very much like this reference image, does it? Have a look. Not too much the same. And even this one, which has a blue sky like ours does, it doesn't really look much the same. First of all, it's faceted, so it needs smoothing turned on. Let's go ahead and do that. But there's something else that's wrong. Let's look at that image. See if you can see it there. This image is too bright, way too bright. Even though the color palette looks roughly the same in the reflections, what is it that makes this one too bright? It just looks wrong. It seems to reflect like chrome, but if you actually look at it next to a reference image, it doesn't seem right. The answer is we have not obeyed conservation of energy. You may remember we talked about that a little while ago. Conservation of energy means being aware of how much light is hitting the material and how much light is reflecting off of it. And if we take a quick look at our simple surface editor here, we can see that the material is reflecting 100% of the light, and it's also diffuse reflecting 100% of the light. So this is actually 200% of the light reflecting off of here. One diffused and one reflective. And diffused meaning it's scattered, there's no image information, like on the base here and on the ground. And the other saying it's not scattered and there is image information. But still, we're reflecting all of the light twice. So what we can do is, if we want to keep this at 100%, our diffuse needs to go down to around 0%. Now let's take a look. That actually feels a lot more like real chrome now. And it actually matches our reference image a lot better too. I'd suggest that a more realistic value is going to be maybe 90% and maybe 10% diffuse. And that kind of softens off the CG perfection of 100% reflection, and it's feeling quite an awful lot better. Now, if you happen to be doing an object like this that is highly reflective and has a bunch of faces facing toward each other, you're going to have to start looking at the number of times the reflections are bouncing back and forth. This is called ray recursion, and they mean the number of times the ray will recur. It'll bounce back and forth. And if the ray recursion is too low, you'll start losing details that should exist in multiple reflections. And I'll show you what I mean. If we go to the Render Globals panel, under the Render tab, you can see this ray recursion limit. And watch what happens when we turn it down. I'm going to turn it down to 5. I don't notice much difference yet. 4. Starting to see some items missing in the edges here. If I go down to 3, or let's try 2. Oh, I have to go all the way down to 1 for it to be really obvious that we're starting to miss recursions. And this is the VPR doesn't exactly line up with the renderer. As a matter of fact, if you turn ray recursion to 0, this will go black in VPR, but watch what it looks like in the actual render. So these aren't quite lined up yet. So this is this is 0 recursions, which means it's only reflecting the backdrop one time. It's not recurring. If I set this to 1, watch what happens in the real render. So you're starting to see more detail in there. And if I set this to 2, so each time the ray bounces back and forth, it adds more reflection image. And by default, it's at 6. This is actually one area where you can reduce render times if you're really pinched for render times. You're really trying to inch it down. Ray recursion is at 6 by default. If you can turn it down, often you can get away with 2 or 3 reflections. But let's look at the differences between 3, 2, and 1. See how detail disappears and disappears, and if it gets to the end and there's no detail, it'll just end up being black in the reflections. So if you're ever looking at reflections and you have multiple like reflective surfaces facing each other and you see black chunks in the middle, it's probably because your ray recursion limit needs to be a little bit higher. So keeping your recursion limit up adds more complexity to your render. Set it back to 6 and take a look at that. So there we go. So you can see the additional detail becomes more and more subtle, but the subtlety adds complexity to the material. So what else can we do that's like chrome? What are the reflective materials? Well, how about silver? Well, let's do a Google image search for silver ball and see if we can see the difference. If we look at our chrome balls, we can see that they look roughly or close to 100% reflective. Let's see if silver balls look the same. And I'm talking about like sterling silver. So let me see if I can get some of these images on here. Look, you can see that these materials look different from a chrome ball. Look at especially these ones. The silver material is somehow milkier than chrome. And the reason is because silver isn't so purely reflective as chrome is. It still diffuses some of its light and therefore reflects less of it. So let's take a look at that. If I go over to my surface editor and I turn my diffuse up and my reflection down because I want to conserve energy, then this should start looking more like silver. And let's just start at first just by adding diffuse to this. Oops. So go back to 10 where I was. So in order to make this feel like silver, we need to add some diffuse reflection to it, because if you look carefully at silver, you see that some of the light is diffused, and that's what gives it that kind of milkier, warmer kind of feel. It's not a color, it's just a feel. So let's just watch what happens when we just turn our diffuse up a little bit. Let's turn our diffuse up to say 40%, and suddenly this feels a lot like polished sterling silver. Now, we might have to turn our reflection down a little bit, or we might not. And, you know, there's no rule that says that, well, there is actually a rule that says that these should add up to 100%, but that's a physical law, that a conservation of energy law. That's a law, but our CG software doesn't really line up with physical laws very well. So we might attempt to do that and look at that. I'm looking at that look much better earlier. I have to recognize that this render is not a perfect physical model, and that I need to keep conservation of energy in the back of my mind and work around and with it, and also understanding conservation of energy helps me debug problem materials. But I have to realize that there's a certain leeway that I need to give myself to go off of the conservation of energy concept. And I'm looking at this around 90% and this around 40%, and I'm looking at that and going, that feels quite a lot like polished sterling silver to me. So simply by looking at the material and understanding what is different about it, the fact that it's diffusing some of its light, and then by going in here and saying, well, I'm just going to turn up the diffuse channel to try to achieve that, is absolutely the correct analytical thinking that will lead you to create a valid silver material. Well, now what if we wanted to create like a gold or a brass? Well, gold or brass look just like this. It's just that they're colored. So let's change the color to a gold or brass color. Let's see if we can find one. Go to our HSV RGB, and it's going to be in this orangey realm. So let's take a look at that. Well, that's pretty pale looking. And the reason it's pale is because the color is multiplied by the diffuse value, and the diffuse value is down to 40%. Watch what happens if I turn up the diffuse. You'll see the color starting to come back in, but now it's too diffuse. This is a problem. We can't turn our diffuse above 40%, so we use the color highlights trick that we talked about earlier. Go into the advanced tab. Color highlights allows us to put the color back in without increasing the diffuse value. So when we turn our color highlights back up, we can see that the color comes nicely back into the reflective material. Now this exposes to us that this looks more like brass than like gold, because brass is a little bit greener than gold. And if we wanted to feel more gold, we'd probably reduce our green a bit. And gold, of course, comes in many varieties. I think this is a little oversaturated. I've right-clicked on the RGB here to turn it into hue, saturation, and value, and I'm just going to reduce the saturation a little bit. But you know, there's so many different colors of gold, it's a little bit subjective. But this is how you get from chrome to like a polished sterling silver to for example, a polished gold. And I think the next question is, okay, well, what if the gold or silver or chrome is not polished? What if it's sandblasted? What if it's roughed up? What if it's frosted a little bit? Well, we have controls for that. Normally, if I wanted to create, well, there's a number of different ways I can create roughness on this surface. One of the ways is I can add a bump map. I could paint a bump map and apply it, or I could apply a procedural bump map. So let's try a bump map first. I'm going to add a texture. I'm going to use a procedural texture, and you can see that there it is. There's a procedural bump map already, and you can see how it's distorting the imagery. Well, this isn't what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a bump map that's so tiny that it feels like just kind of a rough sandblasted material. So I want to turn the scale down. I'll just go with this default turbulence for now and see if I can get that to work. There's lots of different options, but I'll just go with the default for now. And I'm going to turn the scale of this way down. Instead of 1 meter, I'm going to do 1 millimeter on all three axes. So now I have quite a small bump map on here, and you can see that it's so small that it is actually diffusing the light, and it's making the gold feel not so shiny, because the reflections themselves are actually blurred by this incredibly tight bump map. The problems with this approach is that it takes a lot of anti-aliasing to get rid of the noise in here. So let's try a different approach. I'll just remove that texture. There is another method to do it under the environment tab here. Under the reflection options, we're going to leave ray tracing backdrop on because we want reflections to ray trace and we want to reflect the backdrop. But we have this thing called reflection blurring. We can turn it up. So I'll turn it up a little bit and see what happens. You can see the edges in these reflections starting to get a little bit softer already. And softness in the reflection implies a rougher surface, because it takes a rougher surface to break up that light, to disperse it. And the rougher a surface is, the more that reflection gets dispersed, which is why you don't see images reflecting in a piece of paper, although a lot of light is reflecting off that piece of paper. So that's reflection. That's blurring of 4%. Let's try 15% and see where that gets us. Well, now that's starting to feel kind of interesting. That's definitely broken up the reflection quite a bit. You can still see the general shapes in the reflection, but it's looking definitely not quite polished. What if we go to 50%? Okay, once again, you can see that it's even more broken up. The lines delineating the various masses in the scene are becoming really very blurred together. What if we go to 100%? Now it's so blurred that the areas of reflection are just starting to feel like a color of light hitting the material. And that's what it should look like. This is how we perceive colors of light hitting material. We look at something, we go, oh look, there's some pink light from that neon sign hitting that guy's white shirt. What we don't realize is that all that is a dispersed reflection, and it's dispersed because the shirt material is very rough instead of being very polished. This is a pretty hardcore, I wouldn't quite say it's a physical way of doing this, but it's pretty close, almost as close to physical as you can get using this 3D application. There's of course another way. There's always many different ways to do this. So let's just set this back to its default. And the other way to do it is to go into your node editor. And this is our first look at the node editor. We're going to look at it a little more closely later on. But just to give you an idea of how you might create some nice blurriness on this material, let's connect some nodes into our root node here and see what we can get to come out of it. Okay, so inside our node editor here, this root node is the output. So this is what's going on to the material. And each of these little dots are inputs. So we have an input to the color channel, to the luminosity, to the diffuse, the specular, glossiness, reflection. You notice they're very similar to these values over here. Well, they basically overwrite them. So if I plug something into color, this color will gray out. And I'll show you what I mean. I can add a constant called color. So this is a node that has a color value, and when I plug it in, notice how the color is grayed out here because it's now being controlled through the nodes. Well, there's other things I can do other than plug a color in here, but let's get straight to that and I'll go over the nodes in detail later. So what I want to do is add a material, and materials are really cool. They're kind of pre-packaged shaders for certain specific purposes. Like we have glass shaders called dielectrics, and we have metal shaders called conductors, and we have skin shaders. We have something called car paint that's obviously specially for car paint. We should look at that for a second. It's really cool. Car paint is a world of fun. Now, car paint, what you would do to use car paint is you would simply plug material into the material input, and then everything will override everything here. And then you can start plugging things in, like what color the paint you want to be and all that stuff. So you can plug a bunch of nodes in there, or you can change these values by double clicking this, and you get an interface that has all of these. So for paint color, instead of adding a color node and plugging it in there, I can simply dial it in here. So let's see what color we had before. We had 200, 136, 049. So let's do that. 200, 136, 049. So there's our color. And you can see that's the color that we have now. And this, of course, this paint will do more than just make a color. It'll have a clear coat, so you can have a shiny extra reflection coat over the top. You can change the color of the clear coat. You have metallic flakes if you want, so you can make metallic paint with this. So you can see how this was custom designed to be car paint, either metallic or not metallic paint. So it's a purpose-built shader, and it's really fun to play with, and it's incredibly useful, especially if you're making cars. Today we're going to go a little bit simpler than that. We're going to simply add a conductor material. Conductor material means metallic. And we're going to plug that material into the material input of the root node. Once again, we could add a color node and plug it in there, or even more simply, we can double click this, or we don't have to double click it. We can also open up its interface. So the currently selected node's interface will be viewable if we click this. Now, whatever the currently selected node is will pop up there, but I prefer more screen real estate, so I like to keep that closed. And when I want the node interface, I just double click it. So here's the node interface. You can see there's a channel for each one of these node inputs. In this case, once again, we want to do the color, which was 200, 136, and 049. There's our color. Alright, doesn't look much like our material yet because we need to turn up something called specularity. Now here's where we get into some crazy definition thinking. In this context, specularity is used as it is physically in the rest of the world. And when I say the rest of the world, I mean outside of the world of CG. Within our little world of CG, we use a term called specularity, and we think it means light highlights. Because when the Phong shader was invented, the specular value allowed you to see light highlights. But what specularity really is, out in the whole rest of the world, is smoothness. How smooth something is. A piece of glass is really highly specular. A polished marble is highly specular. A chrome ball is highly specular. And not all of those things are highly reflective. For example, a piece of glass is not very highly reflective. You can tell because most of the light goes right through it, but it's highly specular. So here's where a CG artist will sit down and go, oh, if I want to turn up light highlights, I will turn up specularity. In this case, that's incorrect. You need to understand that as you turn this up, it'll make the material seem like it's more smooth. So let's turn it up and see what happens. As we turn it up, guess what? Reflections become visible. And reflections become visible because this parameter is implying that the material is now very, very smooth and is able to reflect light without dispersing it too much. So that's specularity in this context. Now, you may recall our goal was to create a goldy brassy color that looked like it was sandblasted or frosted. So in this case, we have this nice little value called roughness. And the nice thing about roughness is it's kind of self-explanatory. The rougher something is, the more it's going to disperse the light. So as we turn up our roughness, we expect to see our reflection starting to blur. And here's where we get into a little bit more jiggery-pokery. We're reflecting two kinds of things here. We're reflecting lights and we're reflecting geometry in the background. Geometry in the background are things that can actually be seen by the ray trace engine, and the light source is not. And this is what a light specular highlight is. It's a light reflection. So when we turn up roughness, what we're seeing is this dispersion of the light highlight, the light reflection only. We can add geometry and environment reflection into that. And in order to do that, we need to, here, let me just set this back to 0. In order to do that, we need to go into the Advanced tab and turn on reflection blur. So now when we turn up the roughness, the lights and the geometry and environment reflection will both soften. So this is actually the desired and recommended way if you decide you need to do blurry reflections. This is definitely the way to do it. First of all, there's a lot more versatile controls in the node editor. And second of all, it renders way faster. Now you can see how this is starting to feel like a frosted gold look. We'll just pop out into the perspective view and take a look around it. It's very easy to look at a single still too long and not have a sense of how something is really looking. And I think if you're doing shading and lighting especially, it's really critical to actually move around it to even create renders in motion, so you can look around the material and see that it seems to be behaving correctly. See, there's that's the shadow reflecting nicely in there. So that's feeling really good to me. I mean, that feels really gold. The reflections are happening and they're all getting blurred out. So this feels like a really nice soft kind of gold to me. Alright, so that technique obviously doesn't just apply to a gold or brass color, it applies to silvers and chromes and any reflective material. So pretty simple when you cut it down to its nuts and bolts. Reflective metals and even anything that's reflective is actually incredibly simple at its root. So if you're creating these metallic materials, don't forget to get photographic reference and work from that. If you don't, and believe me, lots of artists do, there's a good chance you're going to get to a point where it's not quite feeling right, but you think it's right. So then you start maybe thinking there's something wrong with your lighting. So then you start screwing around with your lighting. And that's not a good way to go. That's almost a guaranteed way of creating invalid materials that will never work under any lighting condition. So know what the real properties are, know what your tools do, and then expend the brain power required to connect the dots between those two things. Okay, so next we're going to move on to glass. Alright, next let's take a look at creating some glass. So once again, we need to have a peek at some reference material. So let's look for glass ball. It's easy to just imagine that we know what a glass ball properly looks like. Let's look at maybe crystal ball. Maybe we'll get some better images. But nothing is quite as great as actually looking at a photograph of what you're trying to do. Here's a good one. Right here, here's a good one. Nothing matches quite looking at a photograph and comparing it right on the screen in front of you while you work. So with that reference in mind, let's try to create some glass here on our little test object. So again, we'll go to the material, and looking at a reference, we imagine glass is quite transparent. Now, often people will say, well, glass is obviously 100% transparent. However, I ask if you've ever seen a lot of plates of glass stacked up together, because if you've ever seen a bunch of glass stacked together, you know that after the glass is 7 or 8 inches thick, you can't see anything through it at all. You see kind of a blue haze. Glass is actually less transparent than water is. For those of you who've been scuba diving in the tropics, you know that you get out on that boat and sometimes you can see 100, 150 feet down to the bottom. It's that clear. Glass, however, is just not that clear. So the reality is that glass is probably, well, depending on the purity and so forth, is probably in the 80 to 90% range. So let's just say 85% transparent. Well, that doesn't look much like glass. That just looks like a ball that's partially transparent. So we say, well, what's wrong with that? What's missing? Well, if we're making our glass 85% transparent, it needs to be that other 15% is probably reflection, and it's probably close to 0% diffuse. Once again, looking at the conservation of energy, if we leave transparency at 85%, we're saying 85% of the light is going through. If we turn our reflection to 15%, we're saying 15% is reflecting. So that accounts for all of the light. If we leave it diffuse at 100, we're saying there's actually 200% of the light happening here. So let's just turn that down to 0 and see what that gets us. Well, it looks different, but certainly not better. The prime problem here is that this glass is totally transparent. It's not bending light at all. And glass is denser than air, and when we look at this image, we automatically presume that the environment outside of this object is air, and that the glass is the kind of glass you see in windows. And we know that air has an index of refraction of 1.0 because that's the standard by which we measure indices of refraction. And we know that glass has a refractive index around 1.3, and it changes depending on the content of the glass and so forth, but we can say 1.3. And if you're looking for refractive indexes, a quick Google search of refractive index or IOR will probably get you a list of various indices. But for now, we'll say 1.3. Now, ray trace refraction is on by default in Lightwave 10. If you're using something earlier, you might have to go ahead and turn it on. And the first thing I notice is that there seem to be a few issues. It looks like VPR isn't fully supporting this yet, so let's just quickly do an F9 render. And we can see in the F9 render that this is definitely starting to take shape. And it looks like actually some of the issue may be that we have not smoothed the ball yet. We can still see the faceting. So let's turn on smoothing. That helps clean up a bunch of stuff. And I'll do another F9 render on that. So there we go. That's feeling a fair bit like glass, but it still has issues. First of all, the shadow cast by the glass, while it is transparent, looks incredibly fake. We have to recognize that this glass is thicker in some areas than it is in others, but this shadow is not recognizing that. The ray tracer is only recognizing a single opacity for the whole object, even though it has depth and volume. Furthermore, if we decide to color our glass, let's say we make it kind of that aqua blue glass, and then we'll re-render it. We can see that there's no difference in the color of the shadow that's cast. Let's actually see if we can get some, I want to get some of that blue color in there. So I'm going to increase the saturation of this quite a bit. But even when I increase it to full saturation, you can see there's still no color in the shadow. Now we can get the color in the shadow with that trick that we learned earlier, and that's by going into the Advanced tab and turning up Color Filter. When we do that, you'll start to see the color of the glass drop into not only the shadow cast by the glass, but into the glass itself. So it's turning into a filtering agent. But still, it doesn't look quite right. And once again, the problem is that there's real density here, there's thickness to this glass, but it's being treated, the ray tracer is treating it as though it's just a shell of polygons, which of course it is. So in fact, what we need is a better tool. Fortunately, we have a better tool, and it's right here in the node editor. So let me just arrange these so that we can see everything. So in here we need a node that's designed for creating glass. We have this great one called, great material called dielectric. Once again, it's a material, so I only need to connect it to the material input of the root node. And it has made our glass go completely invisible because it's currently set to an index of refraction of 1, which is the same as the air, and in that case it would be completely invisible. Have you ever noticed how you can take a clear glass and if you go to wash it in the sink, you can put it in the sink and it almost disappears? You almost can't even see it sometimes. That's because glass and water have very similar indices of refraction. So to get this visible, we're going to need to open up the interface for this node. Here it is. And we'll set our refraction index again to 1.3. So suddenly it appears, and there it is. It's looking very similar to the previous one. But we have this really cool added feature called absorption. And what absorption will do is it will absorb light, making in the thicker parts of the glass and less light in the thinner parts of the glass. So let's turn our absorption rate up to 2. And that's starting to feel like smoky glass. And do you notice how it's feeling that way also in the shadow? And you can see where it's thicker, where the glass is thicker, more light is being absorbed and less light is making it into the shadows. So this absorption is already making both the glass and the shadow of the glass feel a lot more photorealistic. Let's give our glass a color. Let's make this time let's make it a nice amber glass. There we go. And we can turn our absorption way up if we wish. We can make it a very dense dark glass. Now, once again, there are a few little interreflection issues with the VPR, so if we want to get a clearer view of what this is going to look like, we do need to do an F9 render at this time. This is something that NewTek is working on resolving right now. I'm really looking forward to seeing their next iteration of the VPR, actually. So you can see there's some subtle differences. There's a little bit more detail in here. The reflections feel a little bit more physical than they do in the VPR at this time. Now, suppose we wanted our glass to be frosted glass. Just you remember what we did with the metals. We had to say that this glass, instead of being polished smooth to look the way it does here, has maybe been sandblasted or something, so that it's that has that frosted look on the glass. That's very easy to do. Once again, we have a roughness control. If we turn that up, that will affect the roughness of the specular highlights. So the specular highlights will start to spread out, and we don't see any on this glass right now. So what we need to do is include the refraction in the roughness. Go to the Advanced tab of the dielectric node. We have to turn on refraction blur. That's simply enabling the blur to occur, and the amount of blur will depend on the roughness that we set back here in the basic tab. So as I turn up the roughness, watch what happens to the refractions. See how that glass is starting to feel really frosted? Refractions through there are starting to really blur out and starting to look really beautiful. This is giving a sense that the interior of the glass is kind of more of a milky material. But you can still see the reflections on the outside are sharp, so we also need to turn on reflection blur. Now we can make this ball feel like the glass is clear, but the outside is frosted by turning off refraction blur and leaving reflection blur on. So now I can turn my roughness way up, and that has blurred out all the external reflections, but the refractions on the inside are still clear. Probably to get this to feel more like realistic glass, we need a little bit of both. And that's starting to feel like a really good, strong physical material. Now you may notice that while we've taken all this trouble to blur out the reflections and the refractions in this glass to make it feel milky and sandblasted, the shadows are still perfectly sharp. Well, this isn't a shader issue, this is a lighting issue. The problem is that we're using a distant light, and a distant light has light rays that are all perfectly parallel to each other, which is not in concert with reality. Real lights do have some rays that are parallel with each other, but they disperse in many different directions. So real lights emit light omnidirectionally, and a diffuse light, or I'm sorry, a distant light in LightWave does not. So the problem here is our light source. So how can we fix that? Well, let's pop back into our texture shaded view. Let's just pull back here and take a look at our light source. And what we need to do is switch it to a light type that is not fake. It doesn't have parallel rays, and it doesn't have rays all emitting from a single point in space. Now, let me turn on the OpenGL overlay so we can see everything here. So we have our distant light here emitting perfectly parallel rays, and the perfectly parallel rays will mean that the shadow is perfectly sharp all the way around. In reality, shadows are sharp where the object casting the shadow touches the object receiving the shadow, and then they get softer and softer further out. And that can be achieved very easily in LightWave by switching to a light type that accommodates that. And what that means is a light of some size. So that probably means either an area light or a photometric light or a spherical light. In this case, we'll just switch to a spherical light. So my light properties, switch my light type to spherical. And you can see how those reflections or those shadows have all softened, and they feel a lot more realistic. The position of this light is not quite the same as with the distant light, so I'll just try to find a better position. There we go. And now I'll switch it back to a distant light so you can see the difference. So you see these shadows, while the material looks great, the shadows look incredibly fake. But if I switch it to a spherical light, all of a sudden the shadows start feeling right. Just going to back off and move that light a little bit higher and try and get the shadow similar to the distant light. Yeah, so that's fairly close. Of course, we can sharpen and soften these shadows more by changing the size of the spherical light. The larger the spherical light, the softer the shadows will become. And the smaller we make the spherical light, the sharper the shadows will become. So that's how we deal with that crisp, terrible looking shadow issue from the reflections of inside geometry, or rather from the ray trace shadows of the inside geometry. So let's just back out of this material a little bit and go into the node editor, and let's turn off the reflection and refraction blur, so we just get a simple nice glass, like polished glass object again. Remember, we have our absolute favorite parameter is the absorption, because it actually makes this glass feel like it has some density. If we set the absorption to 0, once again we have a really fake looking glass. So nice high values in the absorption, or whatever works for you. You know, there's millions of kinds of glass out there. So just recapping, glass is about understanding conservation of energy. How much light goes through the glass, how much is reflected off, what the index of refraction is for the material, what the shadows cast should look like. And we can understand all of this by getting some good photographic reference and giving it a good analysis, and then understanding how to use our tools to achieve those. So next, we're going to take a look at creating a plastic look. Okay, let's start taking a look at plastic. With any material, when we first start thinking about how to create it in CG, we need to ask, what are the properties of plastic? And just like other materials, if we're not intimately familiar with the properties and qualities of plastic, we want to get some photographic reference. Now, there's lots of different kinds of plastic in the world with all kinds of different looks, but we're going to talk about the kind of plastic you might see in a toy or a plastic model, that kind of opaque plastic with a color. It's a bit shiny, kind of diffuse, and not really as shiny as glass. So let's see if we can find a good image. So let's bring up our Google, and we'll do another Google image search, and we're looking for, let's pick a yellow plastic, like let's just say yellow plastic model, and see what comes up. That's the right idea. Look at this telephone here. There's a nice kind of a yellowy plastic. Let's pick this image as our image reference and see if we can create something that looks like this. See, it's kind of shiny, but it's opaque. It's not like glass. It's different. So the properties are that there's clearly some image reflection going on here, but it's just slightly diffused. Now, if we look at this and we say it's reflective, how can it be yellow? Because reflection is like a mirror, right? There's no color change to the reflectiveness. And what's going on here is that this material is absorbing some wavelengths of light and it's reflecting others. And if we know a little bit about our color theory, we know that yellow is made up of red and green light. So this material is reflecting most of the red and most of the green light that's hitting it, and whatever's left over is being absorbed. So this material absorbs blue light. That's what's left over. You have red, green, and blue, and what's left over is blue. So blue is being absorbed into this material. Most of the blue light that hits this material is being absorbed into it, and most of the red and green is reflecting, and that's why it's reflective, yet not reflective like a mirror. It's reflective with the color, because certain wavelengths are being absorbed and certain wavelengths are being reflected. And this is the really big difference between a colored shiny material like this and something like chrome or a silver mirror, is that chrome or silver mirror reflects pretty much all of the light that hits it, whatever color wavelengths it is. And anything that's shiny yet colored, like even like brass or gold, is colored yet reflective. And this is a little bit different. This is obviously doesn't look like brass or gold. It's a little creamier. It's got more diffuse reflection as well. So we need to balance out our reflective value, which is our image reflection. So we have things in the background that reflect. We need to balance that with our diffuse reflection. And this is where I was talking about reflection. Since it's just a single value, it doesn't reflect different wavelengths of light. It reflects all light equally. And I have always felt that reflection should be split up into red, green, and blue as well. And that would enable us to make a colored reflective material without having to use the trick in the advanced tab of color highlights to bring the color back in. So let's see if we can make this material. I'll just shove this off to the side here. And turn our Viper on, our VPR rather, on. And once again, we're just starting with our basic gray material. We're going to make our material smoothed because we want it to be smooth and shiny like the telephone. And we want to try, first let's just try to find a color that matches with that telephone color. So it's a kind of a low saturated yellow. I'm going to actually push Lightwave over a little bit, and I'm going to bring our image right onto the screen so that we can see the two together here. And I'll pull it over a little bit more. There we go. So let's see if we can match up that color. There's a little too much green happening in there. We want to warm it up a little bit. And I think we want to bring the value up a little bit. And that's maybe a little less green again. So that's roughly in the ballpark. Obviously the lighting in this photograph is a little bit warmer than the lighting we have here. Our lighting is pretty cool because we have a white key light and then blue fill light. That's going to make it kind of blue. So that's a little bit deceiving. So we'll call that roughly in the ballpark and call that done. Now we want to start getting some reflections on here. So let's just turn our reflectivity up a little bit. Now the primary difference, the big difference we're going to see here is that over in the image here there's really bright highlights, actually overexposed highlights, because these are reflections probably of a nearby window or another extremely bright light source. The light values in this reflection are far above the ability of this computer monitor to display, so they're just clipped at white. And the problem here in our CG render is that we're using a light that's at 100%, which is just white, and nothing above it. So what we really need to reflect in this image are image values that are way beyond 100% illumination. We could do that by having specularity on our light and turning it up, or we can take a high dynamic range image and put it in our backdrop. Well, I'm going to go on to the internet again. I'm going to find myself an HDRI image. I'm not going to include this with the content because it doesn't belong to me, so you can go ahead and find your own HDRI probably in the same way as I do. I'll look for a HDRI light probe. There's the light probe image gallery by Mr. Debevic. And let's just pick, here's a nice outdoors HDR. So we'll save that locally. I'll just save that to put that on my desktop. And now I can load that into my backdrop. So you may remember before we had a backdrop, we just used just a simple gradient backdrop. We're going to turn that off now. And instead we're going to add an environment called Image World, which is designed for use with HDRs. And we're going to load in from our desktop. Where is that HDR? RNL probe. And now we have an HDR in the background. Now what you'll notice is that this is wildly overexposed now. That's because the HDR is putting really high range light into the scene, so I need to make some adjustments. Mainly what I need to do is open my render globals, go to my global illumination tab, and just turn down the intensity of global illumination. So I'll start with something like 30%, That's feeling a lot better, and you can see right away, we can see those nice reflective highlights happening in here. Now the VPR here is not being super accurate with the HDR calculation. You can see there's sampling issues down here, but that's fine. When we hit our F9 render and render it out, you won't see any of those artifacts, and I'll show that to you. So you see that's a much better quality, and you have those nice reflections happening. Now all we need to do is pull back up our telephone image here, push it to the side, and see if we can match it out. If we look carefully at the two of these, the reflection highlights feel pretty good, and the main difference here is the tone. So what I'm going to do is, if I look around here, the light in this scene looks fairly warm, and I want to make sure that my light is in about the right range before I start making more adjustments to my material. So I'm going to open up the existing key light that I have in here, and I'm going to warm it up slightly. You may remember we put just a small spherical light in here, and it's pure white. So I'm going to go into my Kelvin color temperature scale. I'm going to pick a light color that's just slightly warm. And since this is a picture inside a house, probably the lighting is incandescent light, which probably puts it in the maybe 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin range. I'll say 4,000 today. Nice warm light. And you see by changing that light, this automatically brings this color a lot more into the realm of this telephone color. So this is starting to feel a lot similar. I'm actually feeling the reflections are a little bit too hot, so I think I need to turn my reflection value on the material down a little bit. Let's try 6%. That's a little bit better. And I feel like those reflections should be a little bit soft. So I'm going to go into my environment tab. I'm going to turn on reflection blurring to maybe 5%, just to soften them up just a little bit. That might even be too much. Let's try 3%. That's maybe even too much. Let's try 1%. Getting this material to be just right can be very, very subtle. That feels pretty good. Let's see here. Let's do an F9 render and take a look at that and see how that's feeling. Okay. That's feeling not too bad. What's missing is, if you'll notice, the shadows in this material are feeling a little too dark compared to the photograph, and that's because there isn't enough light bouncing around on there. So what I want to do is go back to my Render Globals panel and turn up indirect bounces. I'm going to switch it to 3 right away. We'll do another F9 render and take a look at that and see how that's looking. You can see those shadows are a lot better filled in now. And that's one of the real problems CG artists often run into is they'll see those darker shadows and they'll decide to change their material. They'll maybe add some ambient intensity, which is really bad, or they'll try adding a little bit of luminous, sometimes called constant, to try to fill that in. That's really bad. Let me show you specifically what I mean. I'm going to turn this back to 1 and render this out again and take a look at it, and we'll compare the two. So comparing these two renders, this one's nice and filled in, 3 radiosity bounces. This has none. Big difference. So what an artist may do is they may look at this and recognize those shadows are dark and say, that's not working for me. I'm going to turn up my ambient intensity to try to get some more light in there. So open my light properties. I'll turn my ambient intensity up to maybe 20%. Hit my F9 for render. And look, those shadows feel nice and filled in and everything. The problem is they feel pretty flat compared to the one with radiosity. See, this one has nice shape. There's directionality to the radiosity because it's bouncing off certain surfaces, it's occluded by certain things, and it's hitting certain things, whereas ambient intensity is just a flat value. It just clamps the bottom, and you'll notice how much flatter this image looks than the one with radiosity. So this one is ambient intensity turned up, and this one is radiosity with 3 bounces on it. You can see how much richer this image looks. So turning your ambient intensity up to 20% to try to fill in those shadows is a really bad idea. So I'll put that back to 0.5%. And here's another thing that some artists will do. they'll go to their material editor, and they'll say, well, how about a luminous value of 20% to fill that in? So I'll try that one. Well, this looks really quite similar to the ambient intensity, except of course it's only working on one material. So let's compare this to the previous render. So you see what's changing is there's no ambient on the base or the ground plane, but if you look at the actual material, they look almost identical. That's because by turning up luminosity to 20% or by turning up ambient to 20%, we're simply adding 20% to every single pixel in that material. Here's where the problem comes in. If I now decide to turn off my lights, say I want it to be very dark. Let's actually go to our light and say the light is now only 10% because it's quite dark. And we'll go to our render globals panel, and let's turn off our radiosity. So it should be very dark in here. Let's do a render and see what this looks like now. Oh dear. Now we have a glowing ball because we've turned our constant, or in Lightwave we call it luminosity, we've turned it up to 20%. It means we have clamped the bottom value of that material at 20%. It cannot go lower. What if we actually turn our lights off? Well, it doesn't matter. This thing is going to continue to glow. So by turning our luminosity up, what we're doing is we're preventing this material from reacting properly to the lighting conditions around it. So the proper way to fill in these shadows is absolutely not to turn luminosity up, and it's absolutely not to turn ambient intensity up. It's to illuminate it, fill in those lighting shadows by using light. And you could put a light nearby, but that's a complex way to do it. These days, CPUs are so fast that enabling radiosity and turning it up to 3 bounces, especially in Lightwave, is a really fast and efficient and beautiful and believable way to do this. Now here it is without the key light. I'll turn the key light back on and turn it back up to 100%. And there you have it. So the key here is understanding, when we look at our plastic material here, is understanding that there's a balance between reflection and what those reflections and reflection values are. For example, you'll never get these bright highlights without something really bright to reflect. You cannot simply use your local scene geometry to get this kind of thing. If you only had scene geometry, you would have reflections that look, let me bring this over here so you can see it, reflections that look like this one here. You notice this is not clipped. It's a very low level reflection. You almost can't notice it as a reflection. It might even just be a scrape on this plastic. But these bright highlights here that are way, way over low range light are clearly highlights, reflective highlights. You can see it here on the cord as well, and over here as well. So plastic seems like it should be a fairly simple material, but it isn't. It's quite complex. It's even more complex than something like glass or chrome. It's deceptively complex. So if you follow this technique, you'll be able to make plastics in any color that you want that seem to work well. And let's prove that. Let's change the color of our material. Let's make it perhaps a blue plastic. So let's pick a nice blue. Maybe desaturate a little bit, bring its value up. We'll saturate it up. Make it a nice rich blue plastic and see how that looks. Kind of a reddy blue. So what we've done here is we've simply changed the color of the plastic. And if we look at it, we go, well, it's maybe a little oversaturated for plastic, but it still feels like plastic. And the way we can really test and know if this is a valid material is by changing the lighting conditions. So let's make this night light. So we'll go into our render globals. We'll turn the intensity of our global illumination down to maybe 5%. And let's open our light properties panel and make the light into moonlight. So it's going to be let's Let's pick a nice cool color. And it's going to have a really nice low intensity too, like 10%-ish. That's a rough guess. Let's do an F9 render and see how that looks. So it's definitely a darker lighting condition. It's not quite dark enough to be night. But we've changed the lighting conditions, and this still feels like plastic, except the reflective highlights are too bright. So let's turn our render global intensity down to 1% and see how that helps us. That's still feeling like plastic under darker conditions, but you notice that the reflective highlights in the HDRI are so bright that they're still overblowing. So probably the case here is that we have a daylight HDRI and we're trying to make it feel like nightlight, and that's not going to probably work. So we need an HDRI that was taken under nighttime exposure. The main point being that as you move your light, as you change your lighting conditions, the material still feels about right. That covers it for plastic. Next, we're going to take a look at making a skin material. So artists for many, many years have been seeking a good way to create a skin shader. In Lightwave 10.1 with the new skin shader, you're not actually going to believe how easy it is. Let's go ahead and do it. Surface editor, we'll pick our material. We're going to go straight into nodes. Don't forget to turn it on. And there's a shader under materials called skin. Let's hook that up. And switch to VPR and take a look. So this doesn't look like much more than kind of a warm brown color at the moment. But let's make a couple of adjustments. First of all, we're going to put our light behind, because one of the main things about a skin shader is seeing that it scatters through the material. So let's just whip up to the top view here and move our light behind. Let's back off a little bit here, select the light, and I'm going to move it over opposite to the camera and look through the camera view again. So here we have our view, and let's bring up our skin shader again. Double click the skin material node to bring up the interface. We also want to turn on smoothing, of course, which is back over here. Now, the main thing about skin, about trying to make this look like a skin shader, is getting a little bit of scattering going through. Now, this ball is about 1 meter in size. So the main thing that we need to look at is the scattering distance, because what's happening is with light transmission is that light is entering the skin, it's scattering around, and some of it is coming back out. And that's what gives you the kind of translucent feel to skin. If the scale of the object really matters to whether or not this skin shader is going to work properly. So we need to look at the scattering distance. When down here it is 2 millimeters. Well, 2 millimeters is so little that you're not going to see very much happening here. So let's turn our scattering distance up, try to get light going further into the material and see what happens. We'll try like 20 millimeters to start with. So right away we're starting to see a little bit of light scatter into here. And because these default textures are kind of fleshy, this, even though it's not a very organic shape, is starting to feel kind of fleshy. Let's see what happens if we turn our scattering distance way up just for the heck of it. And this is a good idea always. If you're trying to figure out what a parameter does, crank it way up, go really far with it, and just experiment with it and see what it does. Now the interesting thing here is, now that we're going 100 millimeters with this, we're starting to notice that this is feeling kind of waxy. And this is another good thing that the skin shader is for. You're not required to use it only for skin. You can use it for anything that will transmit light, including wax, glasses of milk, alabaster stone carvings, or whatever. Now here's the main thing about a skin shader, and this is where a lot of people run into trouble. They'll get ahead and they'll add this skin shader and they'll turn the scattering distance up until they can see some light transmitting through it. There's a real problem with just doing that procedure, and that is that the scattering distance will be the same throughout the head. And the head will start to feel like wax. You'll notice it. You'll look at it and it starts to feel like a wax figurine instead of a human head. And the reason is because the scattering distance in reality changes all over the skull depending on the cartilage, the bone, the thickness of the skin and the fat and the flesh. So what you really need is a map for your scattering distance. And that map needs to be very carefully painted so that certain areas transmit more light than other areas. For example, in the cheeks where it's fatty and low density flesh, you want more scattering there. At the bridge of the nose where you can feel the bone right underneath the skin, a lot less scattering there. So you need to understand the anatomy of the head, understand where it's fatty, there's going to be more light transmission, where it's bony, there's going to be less. Where there's cartilage and muscle, there's going to be somewhere in between bone and fat. This is the real complexity behind making great looking skin subsurface scattering, is creating that map and understanding that the scattering distance varies over the head depending on what's underneath the skin. That's the hard part. This part, the skin shader, has been made super easy by this skin material. And we're going to be using the skin material, and we're actually going to paint ourselves a map when we get into our next section where we're going to actually be texturing up a human model. So we'll look at that in more detail later on, and we're going to use this shader for that. So in our next section, we're going to be moving on to cloth. Alright, so let's take a look at cloth. Cloth is pretty straightforward. For the most part, cloths are fairly dull. They don't really have much in the way of specular highlights, unless you're talking about a silk or something like that. Let's find some cloth textures. We'll do another Google search. Let's look. We'll just do cloth texture map. Now there's tons of cloth texture maps out there that you can get from the internet and use for yourself. We're going to pick 2 or 3 here that look good. There's an interesting looking one. Black jean cloth texture. And we're going to save that image. And let's find another interesting one as well. Let's see. This kind of gingham here is kind of interesting. Save this one. I'll call it gingham. Let's find another interesting one here. This burlap is kind of interesting too. So let's take a look at that one. We'll grab the full-size image. It's a nice high-resolution image. Save that as burlap. And now we have 3 cloth textures that we can work with. We're just going to do cylindrical or spherical projection on this. There's no UV maps on this object, so it's going to end up being a little bit of stretching, but that's not a problem for this example tutorial. So let's open up the surface editor, open our material editor, and first we'll try doing it just through our regular texture editor here. So let's grab, well first I'm going to open the image editor. I'm going to load up those 3 images. So I'll add all 3 of those. So all 3 loaded in there. Jeans, burlap, gingham. And let's start with the burlap. I think we'll put the burlap on this material one. So we're going to use an image map, not a procedural texture or a gradient. We're going to, let's try a spherical projection along the y-axis. That means from up to down it's going to spherically project around. And we're going to select the burlap image. There it is. Let's auto size it to make it fit. And let's take a closer look at that. Go into the perspective view. So you can just zoom in and poke around at this thing. So that's simply a color map on the ball, and that does not look very convincing unless you're from a distance, because what's really missing here is the displacement. This burlap is obviously very coarse, so a lot of displacement is required here. So we need either a bump map or a normal map or an actual displacement. We're going to start with a bump map. Now here's a trick. Normally bump maps are saved out as a separate black and white image where black is 0 displacement and white is 100% displacement. and then we add that into the bump map channel and make a bump out of it. But the thing is that you can also load a color image into the bump map channel, and it will just read the luminance value, in other words, the black and white value of that image to create the bump. Well, we already have a color image of this in here, so we don't need to create a separate black and white image for a bump map. As a matter of fact, by creating a separate black and white image for a bump map and then loading it in, all we're doing is using up more memory. So we can actually use this color image as the bump map very successfully. We'll go into the surface editor, simply go down to our bump, and we can add it, or we can copy this layer, copy selected layer, and go down to the bump texture editor and simply say paste replace selected layer. Now let's turn off the color channel so that we can see what the bump is doing. Well, it doesn't appear to be doing much now, so there's a little bit of bump on there. But we kind of want to crank it up because the burlap is quite heavy. So texture amplitude, let's bring that up to 2. See if we can get a decent bump happening. That's starting to happen. Let's try 4. Okay, that's starting to feel like burlap. Let's even go higher than that. Go kind of extreme. There we go. That's starting to feel like burlap. And with the bump map in there now, what's going to happen is the surface is going to start reacting to light properly. So let's turn our color channel back on and see how that looks. Okay, so now what will happen is as we move the light around, this should react more correctly to the bump map, which it does. Now there is a fundamental problem with this texture, and that is because it's a photographic texture, it already has shadows and highlights baked into it. So it's never going to work 100% correctly. What we would need to do is have, ideally you'd have a photograph of a burlap texture that was taken under very, very soft light, doing your absolute best to avoid highlights and shadows. Now, of course, the real problem with a bump map is that if you look along the, here, let me turn off the OpenGL overlay. If you look along the edge here, you can see that there isn't any actual displacement. So this kind of breaks the illusion of that bump map. So let's try an actual displacement to make this feel more like a bump map. So first of all, go into our surface editor. We're going to disable the bump map. We're not going to use that anymore. Now we're going to go into the object properties, and we'll go to the deform tab, and we're simply going to add a displacement map here at the texture editor. So once again, texture editor, same idea. We can paste the layer down and we automatically have displacement. Well, we can see that the displacement amount is insane, so we need to turn that down somewhat. Let's turn our texture amplitude down. And one of the things we can see is that we're not subdividing the object enough to get a really accurate displacement. So let me turn this down to 0.1, which is going to be too high still, but I want to get my object subdivisions high enough so that this displacement is down to that detail level. So I go to my geometry tab, and for the VPR I need to change my display subpatch level. At render time I'm also going to need to match my render subpatch level, but for now I'm just going to do my display subpatch level. Normally you have your render subpatch level higher than your display subpatch level so that you can remain interactive in your display, because sometimes your render subpatch level needs to be so high that it won't display very efficiently. So let's just try a display subpatch level of 10 and see if that should give us some improvement. And it does. You can see that there's more detail, but still not quite enough. Let's try a display subpatch level of 15. This is going to take a little bit longer to calculate. Okay, that's feeling better. Now let's we want to turn our texture amplitude down. Let's try 0.03. So now we're starting to get real displacement, and that's lined up with the burlap map. And this is starting to feel more like burlap. Now, once again, since this image was actually taken with highlights and shadows, the greatest displacement is where the lighting highlight is rather than where the actual fibers are. So ideally what you'd do is you would create from your image a displacement map where the highest displacement is where the height of the fibers are and the lowest displacement was where the shadows are in between. This works okay, but not awesomely. So this is a quick and dirty kind of method of creating a cloth that has a really heavy displacement like burlap. The main purpose of this displacement is for these edges, where if it's going to feel like burlap, you need to notice that there's some displacement along the silhouetted edges. So let's take a look at another material. Let's grab this next material here, open up our surface editor again, and let's look at the base. And this time let's add a cylindrical projection of the gingham. And we want to put that on the y-axis so it's going around wise, and we'll auto size it to fit. And it seems a little bit stretched around because the image is square. So what it's doing is it's fitting to the top and the bottom, and it's wrapping around once, so it's getting stretched. So we're going to increase our width wrap around. We're going to make it wrap so it'll repeat 3 times during its wrap. It's still a little bit stretched. Let's try 4. What you'll notice is that the higher we set this, the less stretched the pattern is going to feel. And we can actually start to make it feel squeezed by putting, for example, 10. So what 10 means is that this pattern sideways is repeating 10 times for one turn around. So let's try 5. Yeah, 5 looks pretty good. And the main thing about textures like this is to make sure that we keep our specular level down, so we don't really want specular highlights. A gingham cloth is like a pretty soft cloth, so you never see light specular highlights. And I'm going to copy this layer into my bump and give it a very slight bump map. Subtlety is everything here. So you almost won't even notice this at first. You can see slight lighting differences across here, and that's all we want, very slight lighting. So let's take the jeans and put it on the ground plane. Same process. This time we're going to do a planar projection along the Y texture axis. That means it is projecting straight down onto the ground plane. We're going to grab the black jean texture, and we're going to hit auto size to fit it to our ground plane. And that is obviously way too huge because our ground plane is enormous. So let's try something more realistic like 3 by 3 meters. See how that resolves out. Okay, so we're getting our texture repeating here. Ideally, what you can do is take this into Photoshop or Corel Painter and create it so that it's a repeatable texture. This is not a repeatable texture. You can see the edges, but that's fine for this exercise. Maybe I'll make it just a little bit larger, maybe 4 by 4 meters. And once again, same idea. We're going to simply copy this layer, put it in the bump map. And now there's a slight bump that will react to lighting as it changes. So let's just move our light around a little bit and see if we can notice a difference. It's pretty tough to tell the lighting difference on the jeans because it's so flat. So I'm just going to switch the burlap and the jeans. So we'll put the jeans on the round texture so we can see what's going on with it. So open my surface editor, open my presets window, and I'm going to drop the gingham material into the presets by double clicking it. And I'm going to drop the jeans texture in there by double clicking it. With my ground plane selected, I'm going to double click the gingham material to put it on there. And what I know is that it's cylindrically projected, so I need to go in here and switch it to planar Y. And the same thing with the bump map, needs to be planar Y. And now I'm going to go to my ball material here, and I'm going to put the jeans material on it. Once again, I'll double click it from the presets to drop it in there, load settings, and I know that I need to make this spherical Y. And the same thing with the bump map. I need to switch it from planar to spherical. Okay, so now I have, oh, and I actually have to remember to remove the displacement from the ball here. So go to my object properties. I'll open my displacement map. I'm simply going to disable it. I could remove it by shift clicking the T, but I don't want to be destructive right now, so I'm just going to disable that layer. And I think I need to fit our jeans image a little bit better. So I'm going to auto size it to fit. And I'm going to do the same thing with the bump map. Auto size it. And what auto size does is it looks at the bounding box of the object and automatically takes the texture and fits it to the size of the object. It can be very handy for quick textures. So now we can definitely see that that bump map is working. We're seeing some lighting playing across this fairly coarse texture. So that works fairly nicely. And let me just repeat that with creating these cloth textures, the main goal for this type of texture is to make sure that we do not use specular highlights. Let's look at what a specular highlight looks on this material. So if we had our jeans material here and we started to turn up our specular highlights, it's going to start to feel pretty plasticky. You can see the, well, let me move the light so you can actually see the highlight on there a little bit better. So you can start to see a specular highlight, and it's not feeling very much like denim jean. That's feeling more plasticky. Now, you may want it to feel more plasticky. So if you do, that's fine. Use specularity, and the shiner you want it to feel, the higher your glossiness goes. Let's see if we can increase our bump map and get a little bit better read on that. So I've drastically increased the amplitude of the bump map. And I'm going to turn my specular intensity up. That's the specularity, means the brightness of the specular highlight, you may recall. And as we turn this lower, we'll see larger specular highlight. There you see, you can spread all across there now. So if you wanted to create a different kind of jeans that was a little bit more Space Cadet, you might want to make it shinier. I'm just turning the amplitude of the bump down a little bit. I think that's too high. We should also try to do something that's a little bit more silky. So let's see if we can find a silk texture map on the internet. So this is going to be an interesting experience. If we look for a silk texture map, pretty sure what we're going to find is a whole bunch of photographs of silk. Now, we could pick one of these images and use it, but the problem is, if you'll notice, they all have shadows and specular highlights on them. And specular highlights are really just reflections. So the reflections exist inside the image. And the problem with using photographs that have actual highlight and shadow in them, as we saw with the burlap, is that those highlights and shadows do not react to the scene lighting. So they'll always look wrong. So what we really need is a really simple weave pattern, and then we need to add the specular highlights, the reflections ourselves, so that we can add the highlight and shadow so that it reacts properly to lighting. So we don't actually need a photograph of silk. What we really need is just a very simple fabric pattern. So instead of looking for a silk texture map, let's look for a fabric texture map. Just want a simple weave pattern, and for silk it needs to be quite a fine weave pattern, so we don't want to use something like burlap. And this time we're going to add an extra parameter to our Google search. We're going to look for fabric texture map, and we're going to add the word seamless. And seamless, what it means is when the texture pattern repeats, you won't see that seam in between it like we did with the first images that we got. Let's just look at some of these and find a good one. Actually, I'm really liking this one. This one looks like it'd be an interesting silk to me, but let's just make sure we're picking the right one. There's lots of interesting seamless fabric patterns here, obviously, but I think we'll go with this one. So it's only 512 by 512. It's not ideal, but we'll throw it in there. And we'll call it silk. And let's pop back in here, open our image editor, load our new image map, and let's clean out our material here. Just shift click to remove the two texture maps. And there we are, back to a basic surface. I'm going to turn the specularity off for now. So there we have our simple gray surface to start with. So let's go ahead and add our new silk map. We're going to add it only as a bump though. So let's add as a spherical map on the y-axis the image silk. There it is. It's definitely too coarse. I actually want to push the camera in so we can get a closer look here. Alright, so this doesn't feel like silk. It's way too coarse. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to repeat it quite a lot more. And in terms of a spherical map, you may recall with the cylindrical map we had the wrap amount. For a spherical map, we can wrap it both width and height. So we can wrap it, let's try 5 in both directions and see what happens. That's starting to get a little bit finer. That's not too bad. Let's go a little bit more. Let's try 8. See if we can get a really nice fine mesh here. Yeah, that's starting to feel pretty good. Okay, so we have a very fine bump map. It feels like a really fine weave there. Much finer than the gingham here, you can see. And now the trick to this material is having the correct reflective and specular properties. Now you may remember in this scene from a previous scene, let's just actually, I think we're illuminated. No, we're using the gradient backdrop. So let's put in an HDRI. So we're going to load image world again, which is designed for light probe images. We're going to load our light probe image here that we had, the RNL probe. And we'll go back to our render globals and turn down our radiosity intensity to a more reasonable level, like about, say, 30%. And now what we want to do is make this silky material, which is quite reflective, react properly to the complex environment around it. And remember that any material that's reflective is all about what it's reflecting. So having an environment to reflect is crucial for making reflective materials that look really good. So go back to our surface editor, to our material here, and we're going to start turning up the reflection amount. So we're going to start seeing the environment reflecting in it, which we are starting to see. One of the problems we're running into here is that we're over illuminating with our key light. So I'm actually just going to disable the key light for now, just so that it's not confusing us. So now we see the HDR reflections happening in our material. And you'll see that because of the bump map, because of the very tight fabric weave of the bump map, that the image reflection is starting to become diffused and blurred out. So this is definitely starting to feel, right now it actually feels a little bit too metallic. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the reflections are not yet blurry enough. Plus, you know, the sharp shapes definitely make it feel metallic. If it was a kind of softer, more organic shapes, it might feel a little bit more like cloth. But it's starting to feel a little bit silky, but we definitely need to blur up those reflections some more. So we can go into our environment tab. We can turn up our reflection blurring. Let's try like 15% to begin with and see where that goes. That's not enough. Let's try like 50%. So that's definitely starting to feel better and definitely more silky, but you know, I'm really not happy with the control or the quality that I have using this old method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to nodes. So let's just remove this and turn off reflection and fire up our nodes. And let's use a bump map, use an image in our bump. This is basically the same idea we had before. Instead of plugging it into a texture, we're just going to add it as an image map in here. And the image is silk. And we're going to spherically project it on the y-axis, automatic size it, and then of course in order to see the bump map we need to add some reflectivity. So we'll add, for now we'll just add a constant, and we'll plug that into reflection. There we go. Let that resolve for a moment. And as I recall, we had that to 35%, which is 0.35 in float. So there we go. We're starting to rebuild that in nodes. And what we see down here that in the root node of the surface that we don't have in our layer editor here is we have reflection blurring built right here. We can add another scalar to control that. I could just go and add another one from the node list here, or I can just go copy paste to add another one, and I'll plug that one into reflection blurring. Double click it to open its interface and see that since I copied it, it's also at 35%. So just let this resolve at 35% for a moment and see what happens. That's not bad. I'm going to push that up to 50%, which is 0.5 in float. The beauty of working in float, especially when it comes to color, is that you're not limited to 255, 255, 255. Remember that 0 to 255 is simply the illumination value that your monitor can display, but real light goes far, far above those values. And in order to create realistic materials, we need a realistic level of light. So we need to be able to work in float values where we can push values higher than the computer monitor can display. This will create areas of overexposure, and those overexposures are what start to make our images feel realistic. If we always build our lighting and materials within the computer's ability to display it without any overexposure, our images just won't really quite make it to that feeling of reality. So this is actually starting to feel good. This is feeling quite a lot like a silk material. And we can color this as well. So it doesn't have to be a silver silk. We can make a red silk like we saw in our reference image. So once again, we can plug a color in here. We'll just go add node, go to constant, add a color. There's a color node. We'll plug that in there and double click it to open its interface, and we can select our color here. So let's make a nice rich red, silky. It's maybe a little too primary. Maybe we should desaturate that slightly. And I think its reflection is a little bit too high, so we'll turn that down. Well, let's try 20%. So you see that's starting to resolve into a pretty good silky feeling material. This pattern might not be even small enough. Let's back off and see if it looks a little bit more silky from a distance. One thing that we know for certain from this exercise is that creating dull materials like denim and gingham and burlap is very simple. All it requires is a flat color and some sort of a bump or displacement. And as soon as you start looking at materials that have some kind of a reflectivity in them, like silk, it becomes much more complex. When we move our lighting around, we definitely need our object to react properly to that lighting. Let's turn our light back on. And move it around and see how that feels. So let's just position our light out in front here. So we're getting definitely nice highlights from that light. We still have the reflections from the HDRI and the background. And let's just move around this material ourselves. See how it looks from various angles. Nice reflections happening there. We'll just let them resolve for a moment. They're a little bit harsh until they resolve. So yeah, that's feeling pretty good. The reflection still might not be quite blurry enough, but that's something that you need to you'll need to work on and adjust yourself. I think I'm seeing a little bit too much detail in there, so I think that reflection needs to soften up still a little bit more. We'll be looking at some slightly more reflective materials when we get to actually texturing up our human model. We have some leather to look at. I don't think there's any silk on there, but we definitely have some shiny materials, so we'll take a look at more reflective materials for sure. So that covers it for cloth, and next we're going to look at doing some wood. Okay, wood usually comes in a few different flavors. Similar to cloth, it's either going to be dull, or it's going to be a little bit shiny, or it's going to be highly polished. And this is true of most materials that aren't highly reflective or aren't transparent. Most materials, the main property that you notice of them is that they're a little bit shiny or quite highly polished or kind of dull. And the same is true of wood. So let's load up a couple of wood images and see if we can make some dull wood and some nicely polished wood and maybe some in-between wood. So put my image editor, load up. We have a couple of free wood textures that I found on the internet. Once again, these won't be included in the content because they don't belong to me. So we have this one, just double click it to look at it big in the image viewer. So it's just these old wooden planks. And then the other image is kind of some nicer looking wooden planks. So let's take the first one and we'll stick it on our ground plane here. Open up the surface editor, ground plane, and I'm going to put we'll use this one first, the kind of the beat up wood texture. And I'm just doing a planar projection on the y-axis. I'm not using UVs here. I'm going to automatic size it to fit to the size of the plane. And it looks like my plane is too big, so I'm going to size my plane down. So there's a slightly more reasonable size. Go back into VBR so we can see the image. And you'll notice that just having a color map applied helps a lot. Here, let me turn off the OpenGL overlays here so we can see a little more clearly. What's going to help is, of course, a little bit of displacement. In this case, we probably don't have to use actual displacement. We can probably use a bump map. And what's really convenient about an image like this is that in the cracks, where we'd want it to be lower, the shadows are already putting darker values in this. So we're going to automatically get a nice bump map out of the luminance of this. So all we have to do is go into our surface editor, and we can do this either through the bump map here or in the nodes. So let's actually do it in the nodes. We'll turn on the node editor, we'll go in, we'll add a 2D texture image node. We're going to attach it to the color and to the bump, and we're going to open it up and stick in the wood texture that we wanted. Planar projector on the y-axis, auto size it, and there we have it just the way we had it in the layer editor. And now it's being applied not only as a color texture but also as a bump map. One image being plugged into both places. The beauty of having a setup like this is if you switch the one image, then both the channels will change. You can imagine that you can plug the image into multiple different channels, and by changing one image you can change the inputs to all those channels, whereas with the layer editor you'd have to open each channel one at a time and to plug in a new image. So the node editor can take a little longer to set up, but you can set it up in a way that makes you a lot speedier at the other end. So let's take a little closer look at this wood, see how it's looking. Just trying to see if we can see the bump map happening there, and we can see some light highlights and some shadow actually happening in there. So for a bump map, that's actually working really well and feeling good. Well, one thing we can do to make this bump map really stand out is we can add a little bit of specularity. Now, if this was really dry wood, for example, or pretty roughed up wood, you might not see much, if anything at all, in terms of a specular highlight. But imagine if this floor is really old and it's been walked on for 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 years, and it could have been polished smooth by that usage, or it could be a little bit wet, or it could have been waxed 30 years ago and there might be a little bit left. Whatever. There are ways to add a little bit of specular highlight to this to make some of the nice detail that is happening in the bump map that we can't see to make it stand out. So let's take a look at that. I'll open the surface editor again, go back into the node editor, and I'm going to use the same image. I'm going to use the Luma to go into the specular. Now remember, the spec is the specular intensity. So let's also plug it into the glossiness and see where that gets us. So if we move around this, we should see some specular highlights starting to show up. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm looking at that, and you can see the nice variation. You can see the beautiful variation in the bump map. So this is wood that has been really polished a lot of feet walking over it. Maybe we don't want quite that much, so maybe we want to see what would be best here. Well, it's very easy for us to play with the specular and glossiness values, but first we need to do a little switch to our setup here. So what we have is we have this image going directly into specular and glossiness, and we'd like to have a control in between there so we can multiply those values. So what we need is a multiply node. So what we're gonna start doing is creating a node network that allows us to take a value and change it before it plugs into somewhere else. And this is node basics. So we can go down to the math here, and we're doing a vector. And the difference between a scalar and a vector is the scalar is a number, and a vector is 3 or 4 numbers. So for example, a scalar might be the luminosity value, which is only a number. But a vector is 3 or 4 values, such as RGB or RGB alpha. We're going to use scalar right now because we're going to multiply only by a single number. We're just using the luma, which is just a value. If we were trying to multiply the color, we'd be using a vector. So we're going to add a scalar multiply, and I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here and give myself a little bit of space. And I'm going to change these this node wiring to straight lines instead of square. This is getting a little jammed up in here, so I want a little bit of space. I can open my options for the node editor here, and I can switch the line type to straight. And I'm going to grab my luma, and I'm going to plug it into the A of multiply and plug the output into specular. Now the result is going to be 0 because I'm multiplying by nothing, and anything times nothing is nothing. I'm going to copy this, Control C, and paste it, and I'm going to do the same thing here. Alpha into glossiness. So now I have a multiply for from the luma channel of this map into specularity and glossiness, and I need to multiply it by something, and that something is going to be constant. So I'm going to go into constant and find the scalar constant. There's 1. I'm going to need 2. Copy paste. So now I have 2. This one I'm going to plug into the input of the multiply 1, and this one I'm going to plug into the input of multiply 2. So this scalar is now, and I can close this, this scalar is now the specular value, and this scalar is now the glossiness value. So if I double click on scalar 1, I can see there's a value, and as I slide it, I can turn my specular intensity up and down. There, I went to half, and you can see it's quite a lot lower now. So that's feeling definitely duller. If I set this up to 1, it definitely feels more polished, brighter, and the lower I put it, the duller it feels, and you can really start to see some of that nice bump map coming out. And the glossiness, of course, will change the size of the specular highlight, and it's at 1 right now, so the glossiness is very high. If I want the specular highlight to be broader, which will mean that the light is being more diffused, and that will imply that the material is even more dull, I'll put that to half and see how that works. So that's making it larger, but that also means I think that I need to go dimmer. So I'm going to drop my specular intensity as well. Let's try 0.2. I'll try 0.3. There we go, and maybe I'll bring my glossiness up a little bit again, say 0.7. Okay, so that's feeling like a fairly old wood that hasn't been polished, but that is kind of just rubbed down by usage. And if we look around that, we can see that highlight working really nicely as we move. Works nice. So that's basically your dull wood, and then getting into a few little details to give it a little bit of life that you just won't get by only applying a straight image map. So now let us try the other image that we had, and let's see if we can create a really nicely highly polished wood. So I'm going to start fresh, so I'll open the surface editor. I'm just going to clear out all these nodes. I think this time we'll do the same thing. We'll do it through the layer editor. So we'll turn off the nodes. We'll add the other wood texture here. And there we have it. It's obviously a much smaller scale texture map, and we want to make it feel like this is a highly polished floor, and it sure doesn't feel like that right now. Let's get down nice and low and see if we can get intimate with this floor here. This makes the scale feel a lot different. Just the texture of this floor here. Okay, so the trick to making a floor feel polished is to have high specularity. And when I say specularity, I'm referring to real world specularity, which means smoothness. It needs to be very smooth. And smoothness is manifested in less blurry reflections. The less blurry the reflection is, the more polished and smooth the surface is. So first let's add the bump map. So we're going to use the luminance from this exact same image in the bump map. Image map, normal planar Y, auto sized. So the bump map is on there now. And we're going to use, we could use this image in the specularity and reflection channels. However, that would make it feel bumpy. Let's actually just try that out. We'll throw these in. Same idea. Actually, I can just go back here and say copy the color layer, and go into the specular channel and paste it in. There we go. So if we look at that, we can see that it feels somewhat polished, but not really highly polished, and that's because the luminance from the color map that we've applied into the specularity channel is breaking it up. But let's also try it in the glossiness channel and in the reflection channel. Because if this floor is highly reflective, you can be sure that there's going to be some image reflection happening in here. So there we have some image reflection happening. But it doesn't really look very right, does it? You can see our ball reflecting in there, but it feels pretty fake. One of the reasons it feels pretty fake is that we can see pretty tight reflection in here, but the reflection is really broken up, and it's broken up by the bump map. We see a really broad specular highlight here. So the broad specular highlight and the fairly tight reflections don't really match up. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to tighten up our specular highlights, and then the second thing we need to do to make this feel really smooth and polished is get rid of that bump map on the reflection, probably also on the specular highlights, and then it'll start to feel like one of those really smoothly polished hardwood floors. So let's just take the texture map off of the spec, and the glossiness is now 0, and the reflection, and we'll just turn our specularity up, and our glossiness will go up. Give it a nice, I have to turn our specular highlight down now. There we go. Turn our glossiness up, and the higher the glossiness goes, the smaller the specular highlight goes. And what that indicates is that the floor is more polished. And you can see, although there is some detail in the bump map there, from this image map. It's feeling fairly polished here. Let's turn reflection up. We have to decide how reflective this is. And once again, we have to think about the conservation of energy. So there is a lot of diffuse reflection happening from this wood. And then there's a layer of some kind of lacquer or wax or polish over the top of this. So what we're really saying is there are two layers of reflection happening here. There's diffuse reflection from the wood, and the wood is not very highly specular. It's rough, but it's been polished smooth by this transparent material that's been put over the top, this plasticky, lacquery material. So there's a second almost completely transparent material on the top. It's almost like taking wood and laying a piece of glass on top. You have diffuse soft reflections from the wood, and then you also have pretty sharp image reflections from the glass, but the glass is not highly reflective. So the lacquer on top of this, most of the light is going through it, and maybe 10 or 15% is reflecting. So we'll set our reflection to about 15%. And I think we should take that bump map off. That's actually way too perfect. So I'm going to put that bump map back on. And I think I'm just going to turn it down. I think it needs a bit of breakup, otherwise it's feeling just way too perfect. So let's try setting that down to 50%. Okay, so this is feeling pretty good. Let's just move around here a little bit and see how that plays. Reflections seem to be working fairly well. Let me back off a little bit so we can see it a little better. The specular reflective highlight from the light seems to be working fairly well. The reflection on the ground is working fairly well. And this really does feel like a pretty highly polished wood. And you notice that I did put some of the bump map back on because it was just feeling too perfect in CG. Although I expected not to use the bump map at all. I ended up going back and using it and breaking it up a little bit just because it just felt way too fake. So there's good samples of really kind of rough wood and how it has, I mean, rough wood does have specular highlights unless it's like super freshly hewn, really rough wood. And then there's this nice polished wood. So, and there's tons of variations in between those two. And really the main parameters in those variations are the size of the specular highlight and the blurriness of the reflection. And those are both actually the same thing. Remember, the specular highlight is a reflection of the light source, and the reflection is a reflection of other geometry. And the more blurry both of those become, the rougher we're saying that the material is. And the sharper those become, the smoother and more highly polished we're saying the material is. So if we want the material to feel more highly polished, we bring our specular highlight size down, we sharpen up our reflections. If we want our material to feel more rough, then we diffuse our light. We make our specular highlights larger, and we blur out our reflections, either with a fine bump map or by using reflection blurring, either in the layers panel or in the node editor. So that covers it for our brief look at wood. And next, we'll be looking at stone. Alright, so next we're going to take a look at making kind of a generic stone. Creating stone is along the same lines as creating any other material. It starts with an analytical approach to what the material is, what it's going to be like. And in this case, we're going to pick a granite. And a granite is kind of rough, but it's also a little bit kind of sparkly. And when we say sparkly, what we mean is there's very tiny areas of reflection spread out randomly across the surface. So we're going to see if we can achieve that. So to begin with, we just need an image. Now, it is possible to do stone textures and wood textures and lots of other textures procedurally. However, probably not the most recommended approach. Ideally, you'll find or go and capture some great photography of the kind of stone that you want and either use it or find a way to paint it and clone it into UV maps or whatever, however you're going to apply it. In this case, we're not obviously this ball isn't UV'd, so we're not going to be using a UV approach at all. So I found a photograph of some granite that I'm going to use, and it is right here. Just double click to take a look at it. So it's a fairly good close-up high-res texture of some granite. We're going to see how we can get it to look just wrapping around the ball of our little test object here. So I'll pop into the VPR first and open my surface editor, and for the material we'll apply that image map just as a spherically projected texture. Spherical, granite Yosemite, just rotate, apply it on the y-axis, auto size it. And then I want to turn this object around so we can see a little bit better in the light. I just turn on the OpenGL overlay so I can see my handles. And just rotate it on its heading. There. So that's kind of an okay looking granite, and once again all we've done is simply applied a photograph, and the photograph is so natural, so organic that it's going to look great right away. But if we get close to it at all, once again we're going to see that there's no displacement. Now it's possible that this could be, you know, a pretty smoothed granite ball, and we might even buy that. But in this case we want to put a little bit of displacement and or a bump on it to give it a little more of a rough kind of stony feel. So let's open our surface editor again and go to our material, and we'll copy just like we did in the previous examples. We'll copy the selected layer, drop it in the bump map, and there right away we're starting to see some light highlights happening around the edges. What's really nice about this particular kind of map is that because it's black and white, we can actually choose to make the black areas drop lower in the bump map, or if we wanted to, say we wanted the black bits of stone to stick out, we can actually invert our bump map. There's actually an invertant switch right here. So now we can have the little black bits sticking out, and you can see how the highlights are now on the front, the edges that are towards the light. But I think I prefer it the other way, where it feels like the black parts are in a little bit more. Now what I'd like to do is try to find a way to put a little bit of the sparkly reflection on here. So it means turning on reflection, but in order to get those really bright highlights again, we're going to need something bright enough, really bright enough to reflect well. So we're going to use an HDRI image in the background again. So I'll open up the backdrop options, and I still have that same HDR in the backdrop here that we used previously. So if we look around the scene, we can see that there's some very nice bright areas in the HDR that are going to help illuminate this thing. So now with our surface editor we can just go ahead and turn on reflection, knowing that the reflection is equal across the whole material, and we can see nice bright highlights starting to appear in the reflections. But what we want to do is we don't want the whole surface to be equally reflective. I think we'd like certain parts to be more reflective than others so that we only get certain glints. So why don't we use the same map as a reflection map, and I think maybe invert it so that the areas that are black are the areas that get reflection. That feels kind of right, because the little black bits of stone are a lot higher density. They're more likely to be highly polished. So I think I'm going to try that out and see how that works for me. I'll open the texture editor for reflection, and I'm going to once again paste in the same image, except I'm going to invert it this time. Now the idea here is that where the map is white, it'll be 100% reflective, and where it's black, it'll be 0% reflective, and anywhere in between is going to be somewhat reflective. So you can see it's really reflective in the black areas and not so much in the white areas because we've inverted it. But we really want to tighten it down so there's almost no reflection on the areas that are white, or even not even white, but even light in this image map. Let's just take a look at it. So wherever it's white in this image map, we want it to be not reflective, and wherever it's black, we want it to be reflective. And this isn't quite working the way we've done it, so I think we need to make a little adjustment. So what we're going to do is we're going to clone this image, We're going to make an instance of it, and then we're going to edit this image. Now the beauty here is that we don't have to, like normally in the old days, we would take this image into Photoshop, we'd do a bunch of alterations to it, then we'd load it back in, and we'd have two images in here. By creating an instance, we're not taking up any more memory, and that's really good. I'm going to go to the editing, and I'm going to turn the contrast way up because I want the white, the light parts, to blow out as bright as they possibly can. That way when I invert them, they'll be black and not reflective. And I'm going to turn the saturation down. Just try to make it just a grayscale. There we go. Let's take a look at that. So that looks like it's almost pure black and white now. So we can use that instead in our texture here, the second one. And now you can see that the reflection has totally dropped off in a lot of areas. So now these areas of reflection are really highly reflective and also highly diffuse. So we need to do something about that. We'll go to our diffuse channel. We'll put our image down. This time we will use the altered instance as well. So you see we're bringing those levels down as well. And I think we need to turn the amount of reflection down. And in this case, what we need to do is reduce the layer opacity of our reflection because it's just way too reflective. Okay, there we go. So we'll make those say maybe 20% reflective. So now they're dark and they're also pretty reflective. That's kind of interesting. You can see the seam down here from the wrap, and that's fine. We'll just leave that for now. That's not important. But now you can see how there's some real life starting to happen in this stone. And that reflective highlight may be a little bit bright, but we are using an HDRI. But watch what happens as we rotate. Look at the life that exists in that stone. It's because the light is playing across all the subtle little shapes and through the reflections, and it's really beautiful and powerful. There's one more thing we could do to add some life to this stone, and maybe we should try it, and that is to add a little bit of subsurface scattering. Sometimes when you see stone that is actually carved and it's this thin, you have light coming on the inside of it, you might see a little bit of scattering happening. And we'd probably want to do this in the node editor. So just opening up the node editor, I want to show you a kind of an interesting use for the new skin shader. You can actually use it for something like this. So let's add the new skin material. We're going to plug it into the material input of the root node, of course. And that's just now has all the default settings from this from the skin material. And we need to bring in our image. So the image we were using was the Yosemite granite. It was spherically projected on the y-axis, auto size. And we're going to plug that into the skin color. So that's the color that would be at the surface of whatever the material is. And you notice it's still kind of pink underneath because it also has a scattering color. Let me just open this up for a minute so you can see. So the skin colors is grayed out because we plugged a map into it, and the scattering color right now is this kind of blood color because the defaults are for it to be skin. Watch what happens when we're going to plug our image into the scattering color, which is the underneath light transmission color, and it's now going back to our normal kind of color. And without making much in the way of any changes to the default settings, you can already see kind of a deep luster starting to happen to this material because there's some light transmission going on in there. If we open this up, we can increase our scattering distance to, say, 50 millimeters, because it's a fairly large object in the scene. You can see how at the edges it's really starting to pick up some of the light transmission that's coming in. So this is another way, and now this is, granted, adding subsurface scattering to rock is kind of overkill, and you'd have to be pretty strongly motivated to do it. But you know, if you have a scene where you have an alabaster cup, I mean, alabaster transmits a lot of light, or jade or something like that. This is one of the potential ways to do it, and you can see how it really adds kind of a depth and a warmth and a life to this rock. Let's just go back and turn off the nodes and compare this with our original material. You see, this is an interesting looking material, but it feels very opaque. And maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want your rock to be opaque, but you may not. There's a lot of different kinds of rocks that aren't exactly opaque. And the skin shader is a good way. It's one good method for adding some subsurface scattering to your materials and bring a little bit of light transmission into it. So there's a kind of a quick overview on how to create a kind of rock. Creating any kind of rock follows the same process as we used in our chrome, glass, plastic, the skin, the cloth, the wood, the stone. Everything that we've looked at follows the same process. An analytical approach. First, what does the material do? What does it look like? How reflective is it? How bumpy is it? How rough is it? Understanding what specularity really is, what smoothness is, and how that manifests itself not only in the real world but in CG in terms of both light reflections and other geometry reflections. So connecting this information together is key to understanding how to create really great and good looking materials in the render. And you can see, hopefully you've seen in the course of these kind of little test materials that we've created, that creating any given material actually isn't that complex if you think it through using this method. So in the next section we're going to move on to actually texturing up a real object. I have a model by William Proton Vaughan, a great model called Master Frag, and he has a lot of really great objects that need some really good texturing on them. So we're going to go through all of that, and we're going to bring that model up to finished. So see you there.